Hvala for that. Thank you. And pozdrav, Sarajevo. And for everybody else, good afternoon. I hope you're having a good time in this beautiful city, which is my second home. That's why I'm very appreciative that, Admir emailed me months ago and invited me to Open Fest. Thank you, Admir. Thank you for all the team for organizing this and bringing me all over from Turkey. Probably most of you are liberals, classical liberals, libertarians somehow already. So probably I don't need to remind that freedom of speech is an important value for any liberal. But do we know who actually built the very, very first foundation of the idea of freedom of speech? When I ask this question, people think of Locke, Mill, classical liberal thinkers in the West. But actually, the first person to initiate at least the argument for free speech was a man who lived in Andalusia, the Muslim Spain in the 12th century, and his name was Ibn Rushd, also known in the West as Averroes. He was a big argumentator, he had books, refuting the ideas of Ghazali and other, Islamic thinkers, so it was an intellectual time. In one place, Ibn Rushd emphasized that when you are in an argument, you should properly cite the argument of your opponent, because if you don't, then your argument will look weak. So you should give him the whole space so he can say what he says, and only on top of that you should make that argument. Now, this was a new idea at the time in the 12th century, because people were killing each other for heresy and banning everything that is heretical and that is anything deviant. So Ibn Rushd said something interesting. 4 centuries later, a Jewish thinker, Rabbi Judah Löwe, who lived in Prague, quoted Ibn Rushd, Averroes, which he became famous at the time in the West, and he said, that's a great idea. And he cited him and developed the idea. A few centuries later, people like John Milton and ultimately John Stuart Mill, developed this tradition and took the idea from these thinkers and, developed this full idea of what we call freedom of speech today. And I'll be honest, I'm a fan of Ibn Rushd, Averroes. I read his works, I read books about him, but actually I did not notice this detail. I learned this from an article by Jonathan Sacks, who is the former chief rabbi of England. He has a very interesting article on freedom of speech, which you can find online easily. And it was him who said, actually, we got the idea from Ibn Rushd, who's an Arab Muslim in Spain. And Rabbi Sacks was pointing to this important fact to call Westerners to think that, maybe some of the things that they think only their own, these kind of liberal ideas, actually has roots in some other traditions. So he was calling Westerners to be, reflecting on this, which was nice. But as a Muslim, I thought we Muslims should reflect on this and other, facts like this as well. Why? Because, first of all, when we look at the Muslim world today, Muslim majority nations, we can't be proud, most of the time, about the situation of liberty. Muslim world is not diverse. I'll give that. There's the beautiful Sarajevo and Bosnia, and there are more troubled parts of the world. It's a diverse, and political models are different, lots of things are different. But if you look at, for example, Freedom House, there is almost no Muslim majority country that ranks as a free country. There are countries that are unfree, there are countries that are half free. Turkey is in that category, my country. I was thinking Turkey is doing better. It didn't work that way. We can talk about that later if you want in the Q&A. Tunisia, we should be all proud of Tunisia. Tunisia made it into the free nations category recently. But liberty is not great. And there are, of course, many different reasons for this. There are secular dictatorships in the Muslim world. It's not about all Islam. I mean, Bashar Assad is a butcher killing his own people. He's not an Islamist, quite the contrary. He's a secular Arab dictator. If you go to Uzbekistan, you will see one of the most repressive dictatorships, and that's a Muslim majority country, but the problem is not about Islam. It's a communist country that continues the communist tradition. Just don't call it communism. So there are many problems of the lack of liberty in the Muslim world. But honestly, there are problems that are sometimes coming from certain interpretations of Islam. Saudi Arabia, for example, is not a great fan of freedom of speech. You can get in Saudi Arabia imprisoned, flogged, killed for heresy or blasphemy. Iran, almost in the same level. Saudi, when you look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, countries where you have Islamic law, Sharia implemented as it is interpreted, in those countries, you have certain very important limitations of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to choose your way of life, and everything, all notions of freedom. So we're not having a great time in terms of liberty, but there are also some Muslim voices who say this is good because this freedom of speech, freedom, individualism, this is all nonsense. This is all Western invention. It all comes from the West. We should reject it. We should not buy this. So there are a lot of people also who say this. So I think against those people who sometimes are called Islamists or whatever, however they call themselves, to say, well, actually, freedom of speech and the idea of liberty is not a Western invention. Look at, the role of Ibn Rushd. It is a universal value which may have flourished better in the West in the past few centuries, but it's a universal value, and actually even we contributed to that value by our thinkers in the Middle Ages. Liberty is being challenged inside the West as well. We should not always, we should not forget that also these days when you look at the far right and authoritarian movements, but that's a different discussion. So there is some complication here, and when I noticed this complication, like more than a decade ago, I started to think about this idea of liberty in Islam. I noticed that there's a liberal tradition which convinced me, big time. And I also look at the situation of the Muslim world, which is not great, which is not very inspiring. But then I look at the texts of my religion, the core texts of my religion, and I notice that, well, a lot of the problems we do have in the Muslim world today, in the name of Islam, actually do not come from the core teachings of Islam. Like what? What kind of problems are we talking about here? Let me give you an example. Do we have anybody from Saudi Arabia? Nobody? I know, it's not the most popular tourist destination. But I've been to Saudi Arabia a few times, several times. And in one of my, for the religious reasons and for conferences and so on and so forth. For example, in one of my flights from Riyadh to Istanbul, I noticed an interesting pattern. In Saudi Arabia, there is a ban, there is an enforcement that every woman should cover her head, the hair. So you have to wear a hijab or a niqab, and stuff. So you can't go around by showing your hair. So it's compulsory by law. So every woman got on the flight in Riyadh with a veil, with a head cover. Then, we came to Istanbul. Some of them went back to the, toilet in the behind of the backside of the plane. Most of them came out without the headscarf. Actually, one of them had the most meaniest skirt I've ever seen in my life. And I said, well, okay, it's her choice. I'm not questioning that. But I said, what are the Saudis doing here, actually? When you impose headscarf or any Islamic practice by law, what are you doing? First of all, you're creating hypocrisy. And because by forcing to be people religious, you can't make them religious, you can make them hypocritical. They do it for the states. That's why a lot of Saudis Or Iranians, for example, who can't drink alcohol, come to Turkey to party, go to nightclubs and everything. So you're not actually doing that. Plus, where does this idea come from? I mean, the Quran says Muslim women should have a modest dress, and it is open to interpretation. It can be interpreted certainly as traditionally has been done, as headscarf, hijab. But it doesn't say there should be a religious police to force people to do that. It just says this as a religious duty for Muslims. The Quran says, like in Ramadan, Muslims should fast. It doesn't say there should be men with sticks in their head checking whether you're eating or not. But that's what you see in Saudi Arabia or under the Taliban or in other countries. You have to fast by law if you're Muslim in certain countries. In other words, I saw a gap between the teachings, the core teachings of Islam I find in the Quran and the practice. The Quran has a very important verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, La ikraha fid din, which means there is no compulsion in religion. But there is a lot of compulsion in religion that is going on. That is why, actually, when some Muslim institutions translate that verse, they put parentheses into it. It says no compulsion in religion, right? They don't use it like that. They translate it by saying there's no compulsion, with parentheses, in the acceptance of closed religion. So when you change there's no compulsion in religion to there's no compulsion in the acceptance of religion, a lot of things change. It means that you are not forced to enter Islam, but if you enter, if you're Muslim, you have to be conversed. You have to be like enforced, and you can be coerced. It also doesn't allow getting out of Islam, which is a whole different discussion that I'll touch upon. So these are the kind of things that pushed me to think about Islam and liberty, make research, read the whole literature, and try to understand the roots of actually liberalism in the Islamic tradition and the problems that we have today. So I'll try to give you a few highlights of the ideas that I tried to, highlight. And if you want the details, they're in my book, which is out there for sale if you're interested in books. We can see that later. One thing is very important. If the idea of freedom will develop more in the Muslim world, this will happen by Muslims reconciling the idea of freedom with their religious tradition. We can certainly have liberalism as a secular idea. Many people are secular liberals, that's fine. But in a religious society, freedom will be appreciated only if religion and freedom are seen as compatible. That is what happened in Christianity. Christian liberalism, Western liberalism, didn't come out of atheistic arguments only. Quite the contrary, most of the times it came from Christian arguments for liberty. If you read John Locke, for example, you see he's a Christian trying to make the idea of liberty more compatible with Christianity, actually find the roots of liberty in Christianity. So I think that's what we need. That's why we need Islamic liberalism. And here are two very key issues, I think, that we need to highlight when we're speaking of Islamism. One thing is law, jurisprudence, Sharia in the ultimate sense. The other one is theology, kalam. Jurisprudence is so important because Islam is a religion with an idea of law. And that law is Sharia in its ultimate ideal. When you implement it, it becomes jurisprudence. And there are many problems when you come to the implementations of Sharia in the world today. Women can be, forcefully covered. You can be stoned to death for adultery. You can be killed for blasphemy or apostasy. A lot of things are happening, that are not very liberal in the name of Sharia. That's why it became a, toxic word in the West. Oh, Sharia. People want to ban Sharia in the middle of Kansas. I don't know who will bring Sharia to Kansas. That's a different thing. But there is a problem, obviously. I think this problem can be overcome and should be overcome when more and more Muslims make a distinction between the intentions and the purpose of Sharia law and the letter of the word. Now, what does this mean? I'll give you another example. Again from Saudi Arabia, my favorite country of examples of illiberal interpretations of Islam. Saudi Arabia has many bans, and one of the bans is that women cannot drive a car. Have you heard that? I mean, if you're a woman, you're not allowed to drive. Why? I discussed this with Saudi scholars. Because there's no ban like this anywhere else. In Iran, women can drive. In Pakistan, they can drive. In Turkey, they can drive. Turkish men sometimes dispute how well they drive, but this is Turkish misogyny. It's Turkish machismo, forget that. Why do Saudis don't allow women to drive? I asked this question to scholars in Riyadh, and they have different reasons. They said, we have to protect women, they're beautiful roses, we should put them in homes, something. But they ultimately say, there's a hadith, Prophet Muhammad said so. And so, like, what did he exactly say about driving? Well, they referred to a hadith, a series of hadiths actually quoted in different hadith traditions, which say, literally, women should not go alone without a male guardian. There's a hadith which says they should not go alone in a distance for 3 days, others say a distance of 1 day, but there's this idea of the woman should not travel alone without a male protector. So Saudis say women should not go alone anywhere, like we walk out of the house by ourselves, driving, impossible. But how should we understand this? What is the purpose behind this? I asked this question to a Turkish scholar of hadiths, Mehmet Görmez, who's now the head of the Directorate of Religious Affairs, Diyanet, Turkey's institution, like Riyaset in Bosnia. He told me, Mustafa, Prophet Muhammad said so because at the time in 7th century Arabia, except cities like Medina and Mecca, there was a desert, and in the desert there were bandits. They were attacking every unprotected caravan. If a woman walked from, out of Mecca to have some, nice time in the desert or something, they would kill and rape and do whatever to her. So he said something about that particular context. Now, if you understand that particular context and the intention, it's about security. And if there are men who are trying to attack women, I mean, maybe you should be more careful about female security in that case, in a society like that. Or children, or whoever is, like maybe more vulnerable. But it is something about security. But if you don't understand this, you turn an injunction, which is about protection and security, into imprisonment. You don't allow women to go around. Now, they can even drive a, Jeep, a Mercedes-Benz from Mecca to Medina, which is very safe, despite the are obsessed with the word. Another example, a more serious one, about this literalism versus intention, understanding the meaning of law. Maybe you might have heard this. There is a ban in most, Islamic law imposing countries. You cannot leave Islam. Like if you're a Muslim, you can't say, I became an atheist, or I became a Christian, or Buddhist. Well, I never heard of a Buddhist situation, but it could be. This is called ridda, English apostasy. It is considered as a crime punishable by death. That is why in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Sudan, people have been, in the past couple of years, imprisoned and sometimes executed, sometimes let go because of international pressure, because they converted from Islam to another religion, mostly Christianity, most of the case. So, that's why there's a chapter about this whole issue in my book, titled Freedom from Islam. Because I believe freedom of Islam, I believe freedom from Islam as well, if you want it. There I explain, first of all, this whole idea of apostasy and banning apostasy just doesn't make sense. Because if somebody doesn't believe in Islam anymore, and if he's an atheist, let's say, and I say, no, if you say you're an atheist, I'll kill you. Like, what do I achieve, right? I mean, he can become again a hypocrite. He can hide that he's an atheist and he can go to mosque without believing in it. What's the religious purpose behind this? It doesn't make sense. Second, like most other issues here as well, there's nothing in the Quran that's the basis for this. There's no verse in the Quran which says apostates should be punished. Quite the contrary, there are verses that vindicate religious freedom, no compulsion on religion. Another verse says, the truth is from your Lord, let anyone who wants to believe it, believe it. Let anyone who wants to disbelieve it, disbelieve it. There are many verses like that. There's nothing in the Quran about killing, punishing apostasy. The ban on apostasy comes from certain hadiths, but also the way that those certain hadiths, which are disputable, the way that they're interpreted by medieval scholars. Medieval scholars of the Sunni jurisprudence, and Shia too, the five big schools, Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi, and Jafari, they all said apostasy is a crime punishable by death. But when you look at the writings and their context, you see something interesting. Those medieval scholars were thinking of apostasy as some soldiers leaving the Muslim army and joining the enemy army. Because Muslims were at war with Sassanid Persia and Byzantine Empire and other forces. So apostate at that moment was somebody who left your side and joined the enemy to come and kill you. It's what we would call high treason today. That is why Hanafi scholars, Hanafi jurisprudence is the most flexible of the four Sunni schools. They said apostates should be punished, killed, if they're male. If they're female, they don't count. This was not misogyny this time. There are examples of misogyny. But this was simple recognition that women are not soldiers in medieval warfare. Now, when you understand all this, you say, okay, it made sense in that context. Still, armies today would not tolerate their soldiers joining the enemy army. But changing your religion out of your conviction, that's a whole something different. That should be totally free. And some Muslim scholars are making this argument, like Rashid Ghanouchi in Tunisia, for whom I have great respect. Some scholars in the Shia jurisprudence as well, like Ayatollah Muntazeri, who passed away, made this argument. So there are Muslim scholars who say, no, it should not be a crime. But others are happy, implementing the punishment of apostasy. So the battle goes on. So this issue of understanding the intentions of law versus blind literalism is very, very important. And we will ever have Islamic liberalism. This will happen through this process. But this is not such a novel idea. Actually, medieval Muslim scholars made this distinction between the intentions of the law, the purposes of the law, and the letter of the law. Imam Shatibi of the 14th century, who lived in North Africa, he wrote a very important book, not noticed enough by, I think, Muslims over the centuries, about the maqasid, the theory of maqasid. Maqasid means intention of Islamic law. And he said all Islamic law actually has 5 intentions, 5 purposes. It is all about protecting 5 values. What are these 5 values? Protecting life, human life, protecting religion, protecting property rights, sound familiar? Protecting lineage, like whose son is who, that's why adultery is an issue. And protecting reason. That's why intoxicants, are a problem in Islam. Now, if you look at these 5 principles, and if you take them, they sound very like natural law. Oh, okay, you should protect people's life, property, and their faith, and they should be able to have families, and their reason should be protected from, vanishing somehow. And protecting reason, I would add freedom of speech today, because if you don't have freedom of speech in a society, you become a puppet of a totalitarian state. Very easily that happens, I think. That's the most important way of protecting reason. So if you look at the intentions of Islamic law, you can have a legal philosophy very much like the natural rights tradition in Western liberalism. That's a very different way of looking at Sharia, and I think it's the right way of looking into Sharia. Another issue. So this is jurisprudence, this is law. The other one is theology, kalam, our connection with God. Again, this is a tradition that was very vibrant in medieval Islam. Unfortunately, we lost it. Salafis, very rigid Islamists, actually will say, kalam is haram, you shouldn't speculate, you shouldn't think, you should just obey the rules and nothing else. So that's very, very bad. In my book, I went to the early schools of theology, kalam, in early Islam. And I discovered, wow, there are pretty liberal ideas here in medieval, just in the first few centuries of Islam. Now, I will give you one example of those liberal ideas. But before that, I have to remind one thing. In early Islam, the big political fights were almost always about power. There was a caliphate, the leadership of the Muslim community after the Prophet. Who is the next caliphate became an issue after the first few. And ultimately, during the fourth caliph, Hazrat Ali radiallahu anh, there was a rival, Muawiyah, who was the governor of Syria. So it turned into a civil war between the supporters of Ali and supporters of Muawiyah. This was a big civil war in Islam, big disaster. Muslims killed each other for power. Power is a bad thing that makes people kill each other. It's a good lesson to see that. But we are not interested in the dynamics of the battle. In the face of this battle, there was a fanatic group which came out and said they emerged from the supporters of Ali, but they condemned supporters of Ali as well. They are known in Islamic history as the Khawarij, the dissenters. They said both sides in this battle are heretics. They have become infidels. Why? Because they followed not God's word, but they made human decisions. So they said, only we are right. So all others are heretics. So they actually gave the fatwa to kill all other Muslims who are not like them, who are not in their groups, the dissenters. They were the ISIS of the first century, if you will. You can excommunicate other Muslims, you can say they're heretics, and we can kill them. It happened in Christianity too, trust me, for a long time. People kill each other, heretics for centuries. So this is a very dangerous interpretation of a religious idea. But there was another school of thought, which was the exact opposite of these people, the dissenters, the Khawarij, the fanatics. They said, wait a minute, how can you judge other Muslims and give them a punishment? They disagreed, and they refer to a verse in the Quran which says, God will decide among you about the things you differed when you go to afterlife. So that verse and a few other reasonings in textual sources became the basis of the school, and they said we cannot judge who was the right side in this war, who was the real Muslim or not, because we can't see people's hearts and understand their fate. That's why we have to postpone this idea of figuring out who's right or wrong to afterlife. Let God sort it out when we all die. This idea of postponing, which is irja, that's why I think from every religious tradition you can build intolerant, oppressive, authoritarian interpretations. We see that around the world today. But you can build tolerant, pluralistic, more modest interpretations that value human liberty and reason. And in Islam, we certainly have the core of that in our tradition. We just have to go back and rediscover it. So, with such arguments, it is possible to build a case of Islamic liberalism. For my part, I try to do that with my book. From the 19th century, many Muslim scholars are actually arguing this way. There's a reformist tradition since the 19th century that actually refers back to early schools. Muhammad Abduh in Egypt, Jamal Afghani began this tradition. Many Muslim thinkers, and today I see Rashid Ghanouchi in the same way. Ali Izzat Begovic from Bosnia had great contributions, I think, to Muslim thought as well. So there is an effort for change and gradual, rediscovering tradition, bringing more liberal ideas, and reinterpret the aspects of Sharia. What is the response to that? Well, the typical response to that is these people are heretics, they are spies, they're Freemasons or something. All the kind of stuff that you can say, these people are illegitimate and invalid. They want to dilute Islam and so on and so forth. And also the idea that freedom is not our value, it's coming from the West, we should deny it. Now, those Muslims, those authoritarian-minded Muslims, typically say these liberal-minded ones have taken West as their guide So they have been so, you know, they're so stupid, they just think the West is the truth, they're going after that. They have taken West as their Furkan, the way of right or wrong, their source. I think quite the contrary. The authoritarians have done that. Because when we make an argument from the Quran, they say, no, this is coming from the West. I'm saying, no, it's coming from Murjia. They say, no, 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 you know, you read it in the New York Times or something. You say, Muslim women should not be oppressed. They say, this is Muslim feminism. I'm saying, no, I'm referring to this verse and that tradition. They have developed this idea that whatever is in the West, or whatever, China, or something, must be renounced. I think they have taken their guide as the Western civilization. Whereas in my view, I would judge the Western civilization or the Hindu civilization or the Chinese based on certain universal values that we should all believe in. And it could be the case that the West had done better in certain issues lately, and you know, I can learn from that, and you know, maybe Asia will do better in the next few centuries. So I think that is one key obstacle which should not, I think, fool us, fool Muslims who are trying to make a sense of this or are confused. Why do we need Islamic liberalism still? I think we need Islamic liberalism for two things. First of all, many Muslims are very sad about the state of the Muslim world in the past 2 centuries, past maybe even 5 centuries. They say, the West has defeated us, you know, the West is so powerful, the West came and colonized us, which is all true, and very brutally the West colonized the Middle East. And you see the power of Israel, the Arabs are so weak, which is all true. And then they say, oh, we don't want freedom. Well, if you want to cope with the West, even for that you need freedom. Because Western success is based on freedom more than anything else. It's based on free universities, it's based on free speech, it's based on free research, it's based on rule of law, it's based on competition, it's based on free markets. Even if you want to cope with the West, actually you have to, you know, incorporate these values. You can be North Korea like that too, who can defy the West by becoming a total totalitarian dictatorship, which is not going to help you much, as we see there. So we need to embrace liberty in the Muslim world just for that strategic reason. But I think as individuals, we need liberty as well. Let's leave aside these big geographic, geostrategic connections, competitions, and equilibriums and all that. We need liberty as individuals. Because, as I understand from my reading of the Quran, God created us to be individuals, to go through a life, which is a test, to live this life, to learn things, make mistakes, be sorry for our mistakes, to mature. We can go through this journey only by having a free will, by having a notion of decision. We should be able to make our decisions, so we will learn from our mistakes and we will mature. Therefore, we need freedom for ourselves, which is a gift from God. Since it's a gift from God, we shouldn't sacrifice it to anybody. We shouldn't sacrifice it to dictators. We shouldn't sacrifice it to totalitarian regimes. We shouldn't sacrifice it to people who will come and say, God tells you not to drive a car. Give us a break, we should say. It's my freedom and I drive it because it's a God-given gift. So, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. So now we have questions and protests and all that.
Yeah, great. All right. All right. Time for questions and answers. Thank you very much for that. Yes.
Hello. My question is, what do you think is the future of liberty in Middle East and Islamic countries, like now in 20, 30, 50 years? Will anything change?
We will see. Thank you. Very good question. You didn't identify yourself? Sorry. Matko from Croatia. Okay, great. It is very hard to see the future. Nobody can see that. I mean, like when you look at books in the 80s, they were saying the world will change a lot. Nobody foresaw the internet coming, for example. at the time. So it's very hard to see the future. But here is what I can see about what is happening now in Iraq and Syria, for example. There's horrible civil wars out of sect. I think the some parts of the Muslim world, not all of it, but some parts of the troubled parts of the Muslim world, which I would include Iraq and Syria for sure, maybe Libya, Yemen, the countries with civil wars, sectarian conflicts, and massacres and all that. These countries are going through what Europeans know as the religious wars. There was a time in Europe the Catholics were slaughtering Protestants wherever they found. I mean, there's a Bartholomew massacre in France and so on and so forth. Like, to be a heretic, I mean, there was Inquisition and all that, but even after that, there was a time that sect was a big issue, that you would kill people who were. Europeans tried that for a few centuries. They killed each other, like, for a few centuries. Then they tried killing each other for the nation, and national wars. Then they killed each other for fascism and communism and all that. At some point, some Europeans said, maybe we should not kill each other, and we should find a way that we will trade with each other and have open borders and accept human rights and have these kind of modest, liberal-leaning states that gave us the European Union and all that. I think Middle East is going through those horrible, horrible experiences, especially Iraq and Syria. And at the end, there will come a consensus which will say, how can we have a region and countries in the first place that different ethnic religious groups can coexist without dominating or trying to dominate each other? Now, this is very easy to say as a solution, right? Like, don't kill each other, just have an agreement. It doesn't work that way in human history. People go through these experiences. I think we are, therefore, in a pre-liberal, pre-democratic era in many Muslim countries. When you look at other ones, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there's no civil war. That's fine, that's nice, but there's a hegemony of a family. When you go to Egypt, well, there's a butcher called Sisi who kills peaceful protesters, and the dictator, and so there are many oppressive regimes, and the oppressive regimes provoke violent reactions. And they say, oh, here are terrorists, I should kill them more, and this becomes a vicious cycle. So I think by going through these experiences, people learn. Because in Europe, that's what happened. People learned from horrible experiences. Therefore, in the long run, I'm optimistic for what's going to happen. I also see positive examples too, as I mentioned Tunisia, for example. In the midst of all that carnage, we've seen an Arab country which started the Arab Spring, took it to the logical conclusion of having a democracy, a liberal democracy, wrote the best constitution ever the Muslim world has ever seen, much better than Turkish constitutions, I should say. And we see Tunisia as a shining example. So it can happen. There's a whole different Muslim story out there, Indonesia, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, that's a whole different thing. So, and Islam cannot be, of course, reduced to one region. But to come back to your question, Middle East is going through horrible experiences, and after overkill, sometimes people come to a solution. Lebanon is an interesting case. You know, a civil war like the Syrian civil war took place in Lebanon between 75 to 1990, 15 years. You're too young, maybe you don't remember that, but when I was a kid, I was watching TV and I was people firing guns from one block to another one, like between buildings. They were called the Phalange and all that. So, and one party was, by the way, not Muslim but Christian phalangists who were brutal and brutal. It's not just about. It's not a matter of religion in this case. It's a matter of tribe, and religion becomes a tribe. 15 years, the Lebanese killed each other. At the end, they were so out of men and energy and everything, they had to make a peace. And it gave Lebanon, not a perfect system, but a system of sharing power. Oh, you have a certain number of Shiites, you have some number of Christians and Sunnis and the government and the Druze. And Lebanon has so far at least have come, as a peaceful solution. It's not very stable because of what's happening. So experience sometimes teaches people the value of liberty, the value of peace, the value of peaceful interactions rather than war. And I think that is unfortunately what is going on. But to help that experience, we should be catalysts. We should have these ideas, hey, there's this great idea, don't kill each other, make trade, It's very good. So people should be forcing those ideas. That's why I think we need vanguards movements as liberals, Democrats, peaceniks, reformists, who will help, you know, to get the right lesson from out of that carnage, I think. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah, thank you.
Hello? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can see you. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I will stand up. So, hi, thank you for coming, and I have a few questions, so if that's okay.
Like 7 questions.
7, 8, something. Okay, so first of all, I wonder when you were preparing this speech, did you have in mind what kind of audience you will have? Like, were you expecting majority of Muslims in the audience, like whom you would propose a strategy, or just like a bunch of people who are not familiar with how Sharia, Aqaid, Taqlid and stuff work? So that's the first question.
Sure. Well, I was expecting nice people to find, which I did. I thought maybe you included, sir, and everybody. You know. I thought maybe half of the audience would be Muslim, or maybe not, because I think these are issues, and I thought both sides can listen, because I think the debate over Sharia is such a universal issue now. You know, Westerners are interested in it, Muslims, of course, are inevitably interested in it. So I wanted to give a talk which Muslims or non-Muslims can find interesting.
Yeah, definitely. But then again, like as a Muslim who would love to have a strategy for how can we establish Islamic liberalism, which by the way you haven't defined in any moment of your speech, which is quite a...
I left it to the book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can buy it.
Yeah, but I think it's the fundament, because that's your title, so that should be maybe the basic. So when you say, is it mission impossible? I'm not sure whether you actually gave us any sort of answer or a proposal of how can we make it possible. And as a Muslim who would, I'd love to have liberalism from the Nas sources, not from the external or new Western, let's say, ideas. I wonder, like, have you clarified, is it a mission impossible or possible? Is that a strategy that we can implement today? How are we going to implement when a Muslim world is such a huge entity that we cannot put in one dimension? You have Saudi Arabia, you have Bosnia, completely different things. How are we going to implement Sharia partly or wholly in any of these countries?
Thank you for that criticism. Well, sorry that, my speech didn't come that clear. I tried to answer my question implicitly by pointing to some of the things I've studied. I said, well, Islamic liberalism is not a mission impossible to reiterate, because we have all these sources in our tradition. We have all these schools of thoughts. We can reinterpret Sharia. Sharia can become a notion of natural law. So I was thinking that I gave the answer by pointing to the facts. Sorry if I was not explicit enough. But you're very right to pointing that out, that Muslim world is very diverse. I pointed it out. I said it's very diverse. What we can do after that, well, we can try to influence the direction of the Muslim world, which is very big and very huge, as catalysts in the best way we can. We can do it in our own societies first. Then, I don't know, we can have blogs, we can write about these things, how do you revive and strengthen an idea is a great question. But I was not talking about the strategies of developing Islamic liberalism. I was saying Islamic liberalism is possible, but to have that, we should look at Sharia like this, and we should take these lessons from Islamic theology. Sorry that it wasn't too clear. I'm sorry about that.
All right, thank you.
I think it was like missing a huge part of who are we? Is that ulama who's going to make a huge change? Is that what you're going to do with 5 schools of thought? And those kind of things. So I think it's a huge topic, and this is something that I believe is very basic, which most of Muslims, I think, are very concerned. So that's why I apologize.
All right.
Thank you for criticism. Next time, let's do what the ulama should do or something. This is what I could do in these kind of 35 minutes. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ivan from Croatia. First, I would like to say thank you very much for speaking. This was a very interesting talk. The question I'm asking is from the position of a layman, a person who does not know much. So everything that I ask is purely out of curiosity, I do not know. That's what I'm stating very firmly. Recently, in the West especially, in the light of the things that have been happening for the past couple of years, there are voices that claim that there is a basis in Islam and Quran that, let's say that these voices claim that there is simply no ground for the ideas of liberalism because of some essence that is very different to other religions. And in a way, my question to you is, do you agree? I believe not. But the other thing is, why do you think that these ideas did not catch up as soon and as quick, perhaps, as in some countries in the West? Not to say, I mean, I agree, there are extremists also in the West who disagree with these ideas. Just why did they not catch up in the same way they did in the West? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very thoughtful questions. Indeed, there are some voices who would say Islam and liberalism are inherently incompatible, so it's a waste of time trying to, reconcile them. They don't put it this simply most of the time, but I think they, as you refer to, they refer to a certain essence in Islam, which is by definition political, by definition very much focused on public life and the regulation of that with law. Shadi Hamid made that argument most lately. Shadi is a great friend of mine and he's a very smart scholar. He wrote this book, Islamic Exceptionalism. And I agree a lot with his observations on the current Islamist movements in the world. But I think he makes the mistake of extrapolating from them and to try to define the whole Islamic civilization from the current Islamist movements. I'll have that debate with Shadi later, but just trying to give it. Here's the thing. The people who say Islam is a very self-styled, different religion than other religions, they actually compare it to Christianity. They say in Christianity there is no idea of law. In Islam there is law. In Christianity there is no equal to Sharia. In Islam you have. They say in Christianity, there is no text like the Quran. Jesus himself is the Word of God, and it's been reported in the New Testament. It doesn't make the New Testament like the Quran. Quran is sacred in itself as the Word of God. But I think they miss one thing. Yes, there's a big difference between Islam and Christianity. Islam has to be compared not to Christianity but to Judaism. I think Islam is a religion very much like Judaism. Judaism has the notion of Torah exactly like we have the notion of Quran. Moses is the equivalent of Prophet Muhammad. And the idea of halakha, law, is central to Judaism as it is to there's Reform Judaism, there's modern Orthodox Judaism. And because in the modern era, some Jews look at halakha and they said, we have to understand the gist of it, we can't implement it literally. Some said, no, we should. So it created different roots in Judaism. I think that's the right comparison if you need to make a comparison. And the other thing, people will say, for example, unlike in Christianity, Prophet Muhammad was a head of state. So Islam is by nature political. Well, some people think like that. Certainly many Muslims think like that. But you can also say, Prophet Muhammad was a prophet. He just had to deal with politics because he had to. That was an accident of history. It doesn't define a political nature to Islam as a religion. There are people who think like that as well. You can read Abdullah Naim, for example, Islam and the Secular State. He makes that case. Plus, there's this thing. If Prophet Muhammad was a head of state, who would replace Prophet Muhammad? Caliphs are not God-appointed people. Caliphs are elected by the Ummah, by the Muslim community, which brings the idea of some democracy, according to some interpretation. So it really depends how you interpret your religion. Some Westerners say that in the Quran there are verses about war with the infidels. Yes, in the Old Testament too, there are a lot of verses about wars between Israelis and but how do you understand that? Many Jews and Christians says that's history, that's something about that happened. Many Muslims understand it that way as well. ISIS understands it differently, as some Jewish fanatics understood it differently when they attacked Palestinians, for example, in the 90s in Israel. So I think the people who point to that essence are missing the fact that religions are actually very open to be interpreted in different ways. And they're looking at the current interpretations, the more popular and dominant and newsy ones, and I think they're saying this is Islam. I think that's a mistake. So I find it essentialist, to use an academic term, and I don't fully agree with it. The other question was, sorry, I can't forget.
Why did it not catch up as soon as it did in the West?
Oh, that's $1 million question, and you need books and books about it. I have chapter 5 on that, in my book, which explains why. But I'll give you a gist, which explains why the more rational and liberal schools of thought in Islam declined. I explain its connection to the decline of trade and capitalism in the Muslim world and the rise of capitalism in Europe. It's no accident that free markets and money and trade and capitalism comes with sometimes political liberalism, which happened in the West. And in Islam, the schools of thought I'm referring to, Murji'a, Mu'tazila, they were in the centers of trade. Most of them were merchants themselves, which had a different way of engagement with the outside world. Not military engagement, but dialogue-oriented engagement, and that certainly created a different mindset. So in my book, I try to ask that question too, and I'm saying economy has a lot to explain whether a society goes more or less liberal over time. Thank you.
Hello. I just want to roll back in your speech where you briefly mentioned Turkey. And
sure.
I got the impression that you weren't very hopeful about its future. And I just want to ask, what do you think will happen in the future, in the near future in Turkey? Also, I have one more question after you answer this.
Okay, so sure. You have several. Great. My book has a chapter on Turkey. That is the only outdated chapter. Other chapters are cool. Turkey one is not bad either, but things changed in Turkey since I wrote that book.
What do you think now?
What I think now is, I think Turkey today is a perfect illiberal democracy. In Turkey, we have democracy, ballots, people vote, and the vote is free, and that's fine. That makes us a democracy. But there's a concept called illiberal democracy, when you don't have freedom of speech enough, when you don't have the freedom of the press, when you don't have rule of law, or you have them but in diminishing levels. That's a case, that's what political scientists call illiberal democracy. You had it under Chavez in Venezuela and many other cases. Actually, illiberal democracy is growing in the West too these days. Hungary, Viktor Orban. So unfortunately, I had more liberal hopes out of Turkey. If you ask me, it has become an illiberal democracy. Why did this happen? Turkey was under a secular authoritarian class for a century. We call them the Kemalists, the people who follow Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder, right? They dominated the military, army, the institutions and so on and so forth, and they were elected parties. And this class was authoritarian. They banned the headscarf, for example, because I think it's authoritarian to ban the headscarf as it is authoritarian to impose it. So Turkey's religious conservatives had a grudge against these people. Ultimately, in the past 10 years, Turkey's more Islamic side was able to dethrone this secular bureaucratic class. They were two different powers. One was AKP, the party voted in. The other one was a religious group led by a scholar named Fethullah Gülen. They cooperated together, and with nasty tactics, they defeated the secular class. Then you had a war of power between these two winners, and ultimately, the one that is secretive and cultish, the Gülen element, engaged in a coup attempt against the current government. So they totally delegitimized themselves. Which means that the current government in Turkey is the legitimate government which survived a coup attempt, that's all fine, but it's also a government that has a grudge against the people that it calls the secularists. And we are seeing this kind of payback, revenge time. So every institution are now being dominated by the supporters of the ruling party, which makes it a very illiberal democracy, if you ask me. In Turkey, ultimately, we have to figure out a political system in which all colors of Turkey, conservative Muslims, nationalists, Kurds, Marxists, leftists, seculars, Atatürkists, all of them can feel first-class citizens and treated as first-class citizens. We are not there. There was a time that first-class citizens were the secular people. There's a time now that they are the second class, and the first-class people are the people around the president. So it's become like from one extreme to another. And I hope that Turkey, what I said Iraq and Syria is true for Turkey too. The only fact is that we don't have war with guns, but there's a very vicious political war in Turkey. That vicious political war should end with a national reconciliation. A new constitution which will not be about making one person very powerful, but rather making the diversity of society appreciated. And I'm not sure we're going towards that direction. Is that an answer? Yeah. Okay, you had another question too. You had many. Sorry?
We're out of time, but this is the last question.
All right. Okay then. What do you think about the LGBTQ community and their freedom as a Muslim?
Great question. This is, I support their freedom and their way of life, of course. They should be able to live as who they are. Muslims might have moral disapprovals. They can say, in our religious tradition, homosexuality is not seen as a good way of life. They can have the right to disapprove certain things. Muslims can disapprove atheism. They can say, I think atheism is a wrong idea. People should believe in God. That's a wrong way of looking at the world. But atheists should be equal people who are free, and so on and so forth. I think in Islam, what needs to be done is to be able to distinguish the moral from the legal. Like Muslims will say, oh, in Islam it's haram, it's banned. Yes, it's morally banned. Like you shouldn't play gambling, you shouldn't gamble. A good Muslim should not gamble. If two people are gambling, I'm not going to kill them for that and say, okay, I think it's not a great idea to gamble, but that's your choice. So I think people with traditional religious convictions have the right to think that there's a certain way of sexuality that is more preferred by God. They can think that way and they can have that attitude, but they should be respectful to the people who are not. They should also understand that, I think that's one problem most people don't understand in the Muslim world. Being LGBT is not a choice. People are born that way. So you can say God created these people with this inclination, so what can I do? So that's the argument I make from that.
Thank you very much. Please round.